This video is brought to you by Ground News. As you probably already know, the European economy is having a tough time at the moment. Across much of the continent, growth is stagnant, inflation remains stubbornly high, and public finances are strained to breaking point. However, one conspicuous outlier is Denmark. Not only is the Danish economy growing faster than basically all its European counterparts, inflation has been steadily below 2% for nearly 2 years now, and Denmark's public finances are some of the strongest in Europe. So in this video, we're going to look at Denmark's economic boom, and why it's about more than just weight loss drugs. Could you rank every single politician in the world? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So let's start with some context. Denmark is a small but wealthy country, with a population of some 6 million people and a GDP per capita of about $75,000, making it the third wealthiest country in the EU after Luxembourg and Ireland. Like most other small but wealthy economies, Denmark depends heavily on international trade and has a trade-to-GDP ratio, a popular proxy for economic openness, of 128%, more than double the global average and one of the highest in the developed world. Denmark also has some of the highest taxes in the world. According to European Commission data, Denmark has the third highest tax burden in the EU behind only France and Belgium, with the total tax burden representing 44.1% of GDP. Denmark also has the highest top rate of personal income tax in the OECD, at 55.9%, slightly ahead of France and 13 points above the OECD average of 42.8%. These taxes are used to fund Denmark's impressive welfare state, which provides free healthcare, childcare and education, as well as generous unemployment benefits. According to OECD data, Danes receive about 75% of their previous income for 2 years after they lose their job, compared to an OECD average of about 40%. So, you get the idea. Denmark is sort of the archetypal Scandinavian economy. It's small and very wealthy, with high taxes and a generous social safety net. Anyway, like basically everyone else, Denmark was hit hard by the inflationary spike we saw in 2022 and 2023, with inflation peaking at 10% in late 2022, slightly lower than the EU average, but above that of Denmark's Nordic neighbours like Norway and Finland. However, inflation came down remarkably quickly, falling below the all-important 2% target in September 2023, when the EU's average inflation rate was still at 6%. Now, you might expect this steep drop in inflation to come with a similar drop in GDP. After all, the most reliable way to bring down inflation is to reduce domestic demand, which is usually achieved by raising interest rates, which in turn means less economic growth. However, Denmark has actually seen some of the strongest GDP growth in the developed world. Having only suffered a mild 1.8% contraction during the pandemic of 2020, Denmark experienced a massive post-pandemic boom, growing by 7.4% in 2021, then 1.5% in 2022, 2.5% in 2023, and a very impressive 3.7% in 2024. This makes Denmark the second fastest growing economy in the OECD, behind only Costa Rica. Nor is this some sort of blip. Eurostat expects Denmark to grow by 3.6% in 2025, and then 2% in 2026, with inflation hovering around 1.5% during this time. Nor has it been driven by government spending, as is the case in America. On the contrary, the Danish government has actually run consistent and impressive budget surpluses since 2015. Incredibly, Denmark even ran a budget surplus representing 0.4% of GDP in 2020, during the depths of the pandemic, and then a 4.1% surplus in 2021, a 3.3% surplus in 2022, a 3.1% surplus in 2023, and an astonishing 4.5% surplus in 2024. It's hard to overstate quite how impressive this is. Basically, every other European country is currently running sizable deficits to cope with weak growth and the fiscal demands of increased defence spending. Successive deficits have pushed Denmark's overall debt-to-GDP ratio down from a peak of 46% in 2020 to 31% today, and Eurostat expects it to fall to 29% by 2026. Again, it's hard to overstate quite how impressive this is. The average debt burden in the EU currently sits at 80% of GDP and is expected to rise in the coming years. So, you get the idea. Denmark enjoys low inflation, strong GDP growth, and some of the most secure public finances in the world. So, how did this happen? Well, the big reason for Denmark's recent economic growth is pharmaceuticals, which we'll get onto in a second. But the Danish economy also enjoys some structural advantages. For starters, Denmark's labour market. Denmark doesn't have a statutory minimum wage, but the majority of workers, even in low-paid sectors, are covered by collective bargaining agreements. In practice, this means most workers are pretty well paid, and very few are paid less than €15 an hour. Now, the risk with high wages is that they exclude relatively unproductive workers from the labour market. But that's not at all what's happened. In fact, Denmark's employment rate has risen steadily and is now well above the EU average. High wages have also encouraged employers to invest in their workforce and for employees to focus on upskilling. This is why, unlike most other developed European economies, Danish productivity has continued to increase over the past decade, and Danish workers are now some of the most productive in the world. High wages have also provided the Danish economy with a reliable source of domestic demand, which helped Denmark recover from the pandemic relatively quickly. This is all a testament to Denmark's famous Flexicurity labour market model, where hiring and firing is relatively easy, but the Danish state provides generous unemployment benefits and retraining programs to get people into productive work as quickly as possible. Denmark's bet on wind power, which now accounts for a plurality of all electricity production, also seems to have paid off. While domestic bills are high, largely thanks to taxes, Denmark has some of the lowest industrial energy costs in Europe. This has helped protect Danish industry, and manufacturing as a share of GDP has actually risen markedly in recent years. Nonetheless, while it's true the Danish economy enjoys some structural advantages, much of the recent boom has indeed been driven by the success of Denmark's pharmaceutical industry, and especially Novo Nordisk, which produces two blockbuster drugs, the anti-obesity and diabetes treatment Wegovy and Ozempic. Their popularity has turned Novo Nordisk into one of the most valuable companies in Europe, and it's estimated that something like half of Denmark's recent GDP growth comes from this pharmaceutical boom. Denmark's apparent reliance on Novo Nordisk has even drawn comparison to Finland's reliance on Nokia in the 2000s, which didn't end well, with Nokia's post-iPhone collapse affecting the entire Finnish economy. Nonetheless, for what it's worth, we think the risk is overstated. Finland was more reliant on Nokia than Denmark is on Novo Nordisk. The US patent doesn't run out until 2032, and the Danish economy is in good shape either way. If you want to know more about this topic, there's plenty of other outlets reporting about this online. Unfortunately, it's sometimes hard to tell exactly which way these outlets lean politically, making it difficult to understand exactly how your view of the world is being biased by the sources you're reading. That's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. Their website and app, developed by a former NASA engineer, allows us to pull back the curtain on media bias and have a look at exactly how each story has been covered. For instance, this story about Denmark calling for more joint EU borrowing to fund the continent's defence build-up has been covered by more than 7 sources. We know that at least one of these has been reported by the left, and at least one has been reported by the right. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of genuinely useful features. Take their blind spot feed, for instance. This shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean right, you probably missed this story on Trump's new plan to transfer Greenland's military oversight from US European Command to Northern Command, suggesting Trump is still interested in getting his hands on the territory. Here at TLDR News, we think that Ground News is an incredibly useful tool for our current media landscape, one that's constantly trying to attract your attention and sway you towards or away from certain political viewpoints. Having a tool that helps you spot this and helps you take action really is a game changer. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. This limited time offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.